In the unforgiving dust of the Arizona Territory, a lone woman's act of mercy could be a death sentence. When Clara May Thompson, a widow clinging to her homestead with nothing but grit and memories, finds a wounded Apache boy at her doorstep, she has a choice: turn him over to the ruthless cattle baron hunting him, and save herself, or risk everything for a stranger's child. She chose mercy, but she never knew that the boy was the son of a great chief, or that 5 years later his older brother would return, not with thanks, but with warriors. He wouldn't just save her from her enemies, he would claim her as his own, repaying a life debt with a bond of marriage she never asked for, and a love she never expected. This is the story of a promise whispered in secret, and a reckoning that arrived like a storm across the plains. The sun over the Arizona Territory was a merciless, molten eye, bleaching the very color from the sky and baking the life from the cracked earth. For Clara May Thompson, it was just another day of wrestling a living from a land that gave nothing easily. Her homestead, a small but sturdy cabin and a barn leaning with age, was nestled in a shallow valley carved by Bitter Creek, the only reliable water for 10 miles in any direction. It was this water that made her land a target, and it was this water that now brought her a choice that would shatter her solitary existence. She was mending a harness on her porch, the leather worn and familiar in her hands when she heard it. Not the usual cry of a hawk or the rustle of a jackrabbit, but a pained whimper, small and human. Her hand froze, her gaze snapping towards the thicket of cottonwood trees that lined the creek bed. Her late husband, Jedediah, had always told her to be wary of the sounds the land made. Nature speaks true, he'd say, but men lie even with their silence. Jedediah had been gone 2 years now, taken by a fever that burned as hot as the summer sun, leaving Clara with the homestead, his rifle, and his warnings. Setting the harness aside, she picked up the Winchester leaning against the doorframe. The rifle felt heavy and cold, a grim counterpoint to the oppressive heat. She moved with a practiced quietness, her worn leather boots making little sound on the parched ground. As she neared the creek, the whimpering grew louder, punctuated by a ragged gasp. There, half hidden by the reeds, was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 9 or 10 years old, his skin the rich copper hue of the Ende the people the whites called Apache. He was clad only in a loincloth and worn moccasins, and his small body was covered in scratches. A dark, ugly stain was spreading across his thigh from a vicious gash that looked suspiciously like a bullet had grazed it. He was delirious, his dark eyes glazed with fever and pain. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She knew what this meant. Relations between settlers and the Apache were a frayed rope, ready to snap at the slightest tension. A wounded Apache boy on her land was not just a complication, it was a lit fuse. She could already hear the self-righteous pronouncements of the men in the nearby settlement of Redemption. Savage. Raider. Better off dead. Her thoughts immediately turned to Silas Blackwood, a cattle baron with a soul as barren as the lands he coveted. Blackwood owned most of the territory around her. He'd been trying to buy her out since the day Jedediah was buried, his offers starting as polite inquiries and souring into thinly veiled threats. He wanted her water. He hated the Apache with a venomous passion, viewing them as nothing more than pests to be eradicated. She had no doubt whose bullet had torn through the boy's leg. She'd heard the distant crack of rifles earlier that morning, followed by the whoops and hollers of Blackwood's men on the hunt. Her first instinct was survival. Ride to Redemption. Tell Sheriff Brody. Let the so-called law handle it. But she knew Sheriff Brody was a man whose spine was made of jelly and whose pockets were lined with Blackwood silver. The boy would be thrown in a cell to die, or worse, handed back to Blackwood's men for sport. She looked down at the child. His face, contorted in pain, was still just a boy's face. He could have been any mother's son. In his fevered state, he mumbled words in a language she didn't understand, but the terror in his voice was universal. She saw not a savage, but a child bleeding and alone. In that moment, the memory of her own stillborn daughter, a grief she kept locked away in the deepest part of her heart, rose like a ghost. She had been unable to save her own child. Maybe she could save this one. Damn it all, she whispered to the unforgiving sky. Making a decision, she knelt the rifle, now feeling like a burden. "It's all right," she said softly, her voice rusty from disuse. "I'm not going to hurt you." The boy flinched, his eyes widening with fear as he focused on her face. He tried to scramble away, but a sharp cry of pain escaped his lips, and he fell back. "Easy now," Clara soothed, holding her hands up to show they were empty. "Just want to help. Water. You need water." She hurried back to the cabin, grabbing a clean canteen and a strip of linen from her dwindling medical supplies. Her hands trembled as she worked. This was madness. Blackwood's men could be back any minute. If they found her with him, they'd burn her cabin to the ground with her inside it and call it justice. When she returned, the boy had passed out. It was for the best. Gently she cleaned the wound as best she could. The bullet had torn through the flesh, but missed the bone, a small mercy. After washing away the dirt and blood, she bound the leg tightly with the linen. He was light, frighteningly so, as she lifted him into her arms. His head lolled against her shoulder, his breath hot against her neck. She carried him not to the cabin that was the first place they would look, but to the old storm cellar, hidden beneath a cluster of rocks behind the barn. It was cool and dark, smelling of damp earth and stored preserves. She laid him on a bed of old burlap sacks, placing a jar of precious water and a piece of jerky beside him, before easing the heavy wooden doors shut, leaving only a small crack for air. As she walked back towards the cabin, the sound of hoofbeats reached her. Not one rider, but several coming fast. Her blood ran cold. She forced herself to walk calmly, picking up the harness from the porch and sitting back in her chair, her hands resuming their work, as if she hadn't a care in the world. 3 men rode into her yard, led by Jeb Silas Blackwood's brutish foreman. Jeb was a man whose cruelty was matched only by his stupidity. He reined his horse in so hard it reared its hooves, churning all the dust. "Afternoon, widow." He sneered his eyes, scanning her property with a predatory gaze. Clara didn't look up from her work. "Jeb, to what do I owe the displeasure we're tracking a little red varmint, an Apache whelp? We winged him, but he slipped away down by the creek. Seen anything?" Clara focused on pulling a stitch tight her heart, a frantic drum against her ribs. She could feel their eyes on her, dissecting her, searching for any flicker of deceit. She prayed her face was a calm mask. "The only varmints I've seen today are the 2-legged kind," she said, her voice level. "And they're sitting in my yard right now." One of the other men chuckled nervously, but Jeb's face darkened. He swung himself down from his horse, his spurs jingling with menace as he strode onto her porch. He loomed over her, smelling of sweat whiskey and dust. "You'd be wise to watch that tongue of yours, Mrs. Thompson. Mr. Blackwood's patience with your stubbornness is wearing thin. This land, this water, it belongs with his herd, not with some lone woman playing at being a rancher." He kicked over her pail of water, sending it splashing across the dry wooden planks. "Now I'll ask you again. Did you see the boy?" Clara finally looked up, her blue eyes as cold and hard as chips of winter ice. and I'll tell you again. No. Now get off my property before you spook my livestock." Jeb stared at her for a long, tense moment. He wanted to push to search. She could see it in his piggish eyes. But something in her unyielding gaze held him back. Perhaps it was the rifle leaning just within her reach. Or perhaps even a man like Jeb could recognize a woman with nothing left to lose. He spat a wad of tobacco juice near her boot. "Have it your way. But if we find out you're lying, Mr. Blackwood won't be so patient next time." He turned and mounted his horse. "Let's check further down the creek," he barked at his men. "He can't have gotten far." Clara watched them go, her knuckles white where she gripped the harness. She didn't release her breath until they were a full mile away, just shimmering specks in the haze. Only then did she allow herself to tremble. She had lied. She had chosen. And down in the cool, dark earth beneath her feet, a debt was being forged in secret, its price yet to be determined. The next 3 days were a masterclass in tension. Clara lived on a knife's edge, every shadow a threat, every gust of wind the sound of approaching riders. By day she performed her chores with a deliberate, almost exaggerated normalcy, constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of Blackwood's men. By night, under the cloak of a moonless sky, she would slip out to the cellar. The boy whose name she learned was Taza drifted in and out of a fevered consciousness. She'd sit with him in the suffocating darkness, wiping his brow with a cool, damp cloth and coaxing sips of water between his cracked lips. He spoke in his native tongue, the words, a soft, melodic river, she couldn't understand, but whose meaning she could guess from his tone, fear, pain, and a yearning for his family. On the second night, he awoke with a gasp, his eyes clear for the first time. He saw her, and immediately tried to push himself away, his hand instinctively going to the empty sheath at his belt. "Shh," Clara whispered, keeping her distance. "I'm not going to hurt you. I brought you food." She held out a small bowl of broth she'd made from a scrawny chicken. The aroma filled the small space. Taza stared at her, his dark eyes wide and assessing. He was young, but there was an old wisdom in his gaze, a wariness that spoke of a life far different from her own. He said nothing, but his stomach betrayed him with a low growl. Slowly, cautiously, he reached for the bowl. He drank it greedily, his eyes never leaving hers. They developed a silent routine. She would bring him food and fresh water and tend to his wound, which was beginning to heal cleanly, much to her relief. He remained wary, but the sharp edges of his terror began to soften. He started to watch her with a quiet curiosity. He saw the calluses on her hands, the weariness in her shoulders, and the profound loneliness in her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. During one of her visits, as she was changing the bandage, he spoke. The word was hesitant, spoken in heavily accented English. Why Clara paused her hands, gentle on his leg. "Why what? Why?" "You help?" he asked, his brow furrowed. He pointed to his own skin, then to hers. "We are enemy." Clara finished tying the bandage before she sat back on her heels. The question hung in the small, dark space between them. How could she explain it? How could she describe the hollow ache in her heart, the ghost of a child she never got to hold? "A child in pain isn't an enemy," she said simply. "He's just a child." He seemed to consider this, his gaze thoughtful. "My father, he is a great chief. Nakai." Clara's breath caught. Chief Nakai. She'd heard the name whispered in redemption, spoken with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. He was the leader of a formidable band of Chiricahua Apache, a man who had resisted the government's attempts to force his people onto a reservation. To be hiding the son of Nakai was a danger beyond anything she had imagined. "They will look for me, Taza," continued, a note of pride in his voice. "My brother Kyle. He will find me." A few days later, Taza was strong enough to stand his limp, pronounced but manageable. The fever was gone, and the color had returned to his face. He was growing restless in the confines of the cellar, his spirit yearning for the open sky. Clara knew she couldn't keep him hidden forever. Blackwood's men were still patrolling the area, their presence a constant low-grade threat. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon in hues of orange and purple, Taza spoke with a new urgency. "I must go. Tonight." Clara's heart clenched. She had grown accustomed to her secret companion, to the purpose his presence had given her empty days. The thought of being truly alone again was a sudden, sharp pain. "Are you sure you're strong enough?" she asked, her voice betraying more concern than she intended. He nodded, his jaw set with a determination that made him look older than his years. "I know the way. From the stars. My brother taught me." He looked at her, and for the first time, a small, genuine smile touched his lips. "You will not be forgotten. The son of Nakai does not forget a debt." He then reached into a small pouch she hadn't noticed before, and pulled out a single eagle feather, its edge tipped with fine red thread. He held it out to her. "For you," he said. "So they know." Clara took the feather, its texture surprisingly soft. It felt momentous, a symbol of the bond forged between them in secrecy and shadow. She packed him a small satchel with the last of her jerky, a full canteen, and a piece of cornbread. Under the cover of deepest night, when the world was asleep, and only the coyotes were singing, she led him from the cellar. The air was cool and smelled of sage. Taza moved with a natural stealth that amazed her, melting into the shadows of the whispering cottonwoods along the creek. Before he disappeared completely, he turned back one last time. He didn't wave or say goodbye. He simply raised his hand palm forward, a gesture of respect that felt more profound than any words. And then he was gone. Clara stood by the creek for a long time, the eagle feather clutched in her hand. The silence of her homestead rushed back in colder and more absolute than before. She had done the right thing, she knew, but the risk she had taken lingered in the air. She had saved the Apache Chief's son. Now she was left to face the consequences alone, with nothing but a secret and a feather to remember him by. She tucked the feather into her small wooden keepsake box beneath a lock of Jedediah's hair, and her mother's locket, a treasure hidden among treasures. 5 years. 5 years is a lifetime in the territory. It was long enough for the memory of the Apache boy to fade into a half-remembered dream, a dangerous secret that Clara May Thompson kept buried as deep as the cellar where she'd hidden him. The land, however, never forgot. And neither did Silas Blackwood. The pressure from him was a slow, grinding siege. He didn't use overt violence again. He was cleverer than that. He started by legally challenging the boundaries of her property, claiming the official survey was wrong. The fight cost Clara most of Jedediah's savings to pay for a lawyer in the territorial capital. She won, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. Then he choked her supply lines. The merchants in Redemption, either intimidated by Blackwood or in his pocket, suddenly found their prices for her doubling. Orders for seed and feed were mysteriously lost. The blacksmith, a decent man named Bartholomew, would do work for her, but only after dark, apologizing profusely. "It's Blackwood Clara," he'd mutter, his face grim in the lamplight of his forge. "He's put the word out. Anyone who helps you is an enemy of his." Clara became an island. The women of the town who had once offered condolences after Jedediah's death now crossed the street to avoid her. Whispers followed her like shadows, branding her as stubborn, foolish, even touched in the head for trying to hold on to a homestead a lone woman had no business running. The isolation was a cancer eating away at her spirit. But the land, the same land that tried to kill her with its heat and its droughts, also sustained her. She learned its rhythms, its secrets. She learned which wild plants were edible, how to track the small game that lived by the creek, and how to read the clouds for the faintest promise of rain. The homestead became less of a property and more of an extension of herself. Its soil was mingled with her sweat, its silence filled with her thoughts. Giving it up would be like cutting off a limb. She grew harder, leaner. The soft edges of her grief for Jedediah were worn away by the constant friction of survival, leaving a core of pure, unyielding resolve. Her blue eyes, once filled with sorrow, now held the flat, watchful calm of a hawk. She was no longer just Jedediah's widow. She was Clara May Thompson, and this land was hers. The eagle feather remained in its box. Sometimes, on the loneliest nights, she would take it out. It was a reminder that she was capable of a profound and dangerous kindness, a part of herself that the harsh years and the town's scorn had not managed to extinguish. She often wondered what became of Taza. Was he alive? Did he remember her? Or had her act of mercy been forgotten? A stone dropped into a deep, silent well. The end of the 5th year was the driest on record. The creek her lifeblood slowed to a muddy trickle. Her well was nearly dry. Blackwood knew it. This was his chance to break her for good. He arrived not with his thuggish foreman, but with Sheriff Brody in tow. The sheriff, a man whose gut spilled over his gun belt, had the decency to look ashamed. Blackwood, on the other hand, was the picture of triumph. He was dressed in a fine black suit, a stark and ridiculous sight in the blistering heat, his face smug. "Clara," he said, his voice slick with false sympathy. "It's over." He produced a stack of papers. "Legal notices. You're behind on your territorial taxes, and I've filed a claim for water rights, given the drought. The judge, being a reasonable man, has sided with me. The law says this property is to be auctioned off to settle your debts. And I, of course, will be the sole bidder." Clara stared at the papers. It was all a lie, a fabrication built on bribery and influence, but it was dressed in the authority of the law. Sheriff Brody cleared his throat. "You have until sundown tomorrow to vacate the premises." "Clara," he mumbled, refusing to meet her eyes. "I'm sorry, but it's the law." "The law?" Clara's voice was a low, dangerous whisper. She looked from the pathetic sheriff to Blackwood's sneering face. "This isn't the law. This is theft with a fancy signature." Blackwood chuckled. "Call it what you will. The result is the same. Tomorrow this valley belongs to me. I'd advise you to pack what you can carry. My men will be here to escort you out." He turned to leave his victory absolute. Clara stood on her porch, the eviction notice clutched in her hand, watching them ride away. Despair, a feeling she had fought off for 5 long years, finally washed over her. She had lost. The homestead, her home, Jedediah's legacy. It was all gone. She sank into her chair, the same chair where she had mended a harness 5 years ago, and for the first time since her husband's funeral, she wept. She cried for Jedediah, for her lost child, for the years of struggle that had amounted to nothing. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in cruel, beautiful colors, marking the end of her last full day on the land she called home. The world had shrunk to the size of her porch and the overwhelming weight of her defeat. The next day dawned with a strange, oppressive stillness. The air was thick and heavy, the sky a hazy brass-colored dome. A storm was brewing in the east, the clouds on the horizon, the color of a deep bruise. It was a fitting backdrop for the end of Clara's world. She didn't pack. To pack would be to accept defeat, to admit that Blackwood had won. Instead, she put on her best dress, a simple blue calico she'd saved for church visits she no longer made. She brushed her hair, tying it back, not with a work-worn ribbon, but with a silken one from her keepsake box. She would face them not as a broken homesteader, but as the mistress of this land, even if only for a few more hours. She sat on her porch, the Winchester rifle laid across her lap. It wasn't loaded. She wasn't foolish enough to think she could fight them, but it was a symbol of her defiance. She would not be chased off her own land like a scared rabbit. She would make them look her in the eye as they tore her life apart. Just after noon they arrived. Blackwood rode at the head, flanked by Sheriff Brody and a dozen of his men, including Jeb, who wore a particularly malevolent grin. They fanned out in her yard a small army come to evict a single woman. Blackwood dismounted and swaggered towards the porch, his boots kicking up clouds of dust. "Well, Clara, I see you've decided against making this easy. I hope you're not planning on using that thing." He gestured to the rifle with a smirk. "It's to keep the snakes out of my house," Clara said, her voice clear and steady. "And it seems I've missed one." Blackwood's smirk vanished. "Your time is up. Get off my land." "This isn't your land until my feet have left it," she retorted, her gaze unwavering. "And I'm not leaving." A tense silence fell. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. Jeb and the others gripped their pistols, eager for an excuse. Blackwood's face flushed with anger. He had expected tears and begging, not this cold fury. Sheriff Blackwood snapped. "Do your duty. Remove her." Sheriff Brody hesitated, then began to lumber up the porch steps, his hand hovering over his gun. "Now, Clara, don't make this harder than it has to be." It was then that the world changed. A sound, faint at first, then growing rapidly, reached them. It was a low, rhythmic thunder that wasn't coming from the storm clouds. It was the sound of dozens of galloping horses, coming not from the direction of the town, but from the east, from the sun-scorched plains of the Apache lands. Everyone froze. Blackwood's men turned in their saddles, their bravado evaporating into confusion and fear. The thunder grew to a deafening roar, and then they appeared cresting the ridge that bordered Clara's property. A line of Apache warriors, their faces painted for war, their lances and rifles held high. They moved with a fluid, terrifying grace, their ponies eating up the ground. They were not a raiding party. They were an army, and they rode with a purpose that was aimed directly at the homestead. At their head rode a man who seemed carved from the very rock and heat of the land. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his bare chest crisscrossed with the scars of old battles. His black hair flowed freely behind him, held back by a simple leather band. His face was stark and handsome, his eyes as dark and intense as a midnight storm. He carried himself with an aura of absolute command. As they drew closer, Clara saw a younger man riding beside him, a man now in his mid-teens with a familiar face and a slight limp. Taza. Her heart stopped. The warriors flowed into the valley and formed a silent, menacing semicircle behind Blackwood and his men, trapping them against the cabin. They didn't whoop or yell. Their silence was far more frightening. The leader reined his horse to a halt directly in front of the porch, his gaze sweeping over the scene. Blackwood, the sheriff, Clara with the rifle in her lap. His eyes, when they finally settled on her, were piercing, analytical, and held a flicker of something she couldn't name. This, she knew, without a doubt, was Kyle. Blackwood, recovering from his shock, puffed out his chest. "What is the meaning of this? I am Silas Blackwood. This is my property. You savages turn around and ride out before I—" Kyle didn't even glance at him. His focus was entirely on Clara. He swung down from his horse in one smooth motion. He was even more imposing on foot, a figure of raw power and authority. He walked past Blackwood as if he were a piece of furniture, and stopped at the bottom of her porch steps. "You are the woman called Clara May Thompson," he stated. It was not a question. His voice was a low baritone, laced with the same accent Taza had possessed, but deeper, more resonant. Clara could only nod, her throat suddenly dry. Kyle's eyes flickered to the rifle on her lap. "5 years ago, you gave shelter to my brother Taza, son of our chief Nakai. You healed his wound and saved him from these dogs." He finally deigned to gesture contemptuously towards Blackwood's men. Blackwood sputtered, "That's a lie, she—" Kyle's head snapped towards him, and his eyes were so filled with cold fire that Blackwood physically recoiled. "You will be silent, or you will be silenced." Returning his attention to Clara, Kyle continued, "A life debt was made. My father Nakai does not leave such debts unpaid. Taza told us of the woman with eyes the color of the sky after a storm who was brave and kind. He also told us of the men who hunt on her land and seek to steal it from her." He took a step closer, his presence commanding the very air she breathed. "The debt must now be paid. Your troubles with these men are over. You are under the protection of my people." Clara felt a dizzying wave of relief, so potent it almost buckled her knees. But it was immediately followed by confusion as Kyle continued. "A life for a life," he declared, his voice ringing out for all to hear. "You saved the blood of our chief. In return, you will be brought into our family. You will be honored. The debt is paid with a bond. I, Kyle, war chief of the NDE, claim you as my bride. You will come with us now. It is the way." The world tilted on its axis. Bride. He had come back with warriors not just to save her, but to claim her. It wasn't a proposal, it was a decree, a transaction, a life for a life. Before she could process the shock, Jeb the foreman made a fatal error in judgment. "The hell you say," he roared, drawing his pistol. "No damn Apache is taking a white woman." He never finished the sentence. An arrow, a black blur of motion, sprouted from his throat. He gurgled, his eyes wide with surprise, and collapsed in the dust. Panic erupted. Blackwood's men scrambled for their guns, but they were hopelessly outmaneuvered. The Apache warriors descended a whirlwind of controlled deadly force. It wasn't a battle. It was a disarming. Within seconds, the ranchers were weaponless, pulled from their horses, and subdued. Kyle hadn't moved. He watched the proceedings with a detached calm. He then walked over to the terrified, whimpering Silas Blackwood, who was being held by 2 warriors. Kyle looked him up and down with utter disdain. "This land is not yours," Kyle said, his voice deadly quiet. "It belongs to her, and she now belongs to me. You will leave this valley, and you will never return. If I ever see your face again, I will gift it to the crows." He turned and walked back to Clara, leaving Blackwood trembling and pale. He extended a hand to her. "It is time to go." Clara looked at his outstretched hand, then at the chaos in her yard, at the body of Jeb, lying in the dust, at the stunned face of Taza, who gave her a small, uncertain smile. She looked at her home, the cabin she had fought for, bled for. She was being saved from one prison only to be delivered to another. This was not a rescue. It was an abduction wrapped in the language of honor. Her life on the homestead was over. A new, terrifying and uncertain life was just beginning. With a hand that trembled only slightly, she placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, warm, and absolute. The journey to the Apache stronghold was a blur of motion and sensation. Clara rode a gentle mare one of the warriors provided, positioned in the center of the formation, a protected and conspicuous prize. Kyle rode beside her, his expression unreadable, his silence a heavy blanket. They moved with incredible speed and efficiency, flowing through the rugged landscape of canyons and mesas as if they were born of the rock itself. The world she knew, the rolling plains, the familiar shape of the distant mountains vanished behind her, replaced by a terrain that was stark, beautiful, and alien. This was the Apache, the land of the NDA. It was a world of sharp edges, hidden water, and endless sky. Clara was caught in a maelstrom of emotions. There was a sliver of gratitude. Kyle had saved her of that, there was no doubt. Blackwood would have seen her dead or destitute, but that gratitude was choked by a rising tide of fear and resentment. A bride claimed like property. Her defiance, the bedrock of her existence, for 5 years bristled at the command. She was no one's prize, no one's debt payment. After 2 days of relentless travel, they arrived. The stronghold or rancheria was not the primitive camp she might have imagined. It was a large, semi-permanent settlement, nestled in a high, hidden valley, fortified by sheer canyon walls on 3 sides. It was a bustling community of wicker and hide wickiups, cooking fires, sending fragrant smoke into the air, the sounds of children laughing and dogs barking. Their arrival caused an immediate stir. The entire village seemed to turn out, their dark eyes filled with an intense curiosity as they stared at her, the white woman brought into their midst. She felt like a creature in a zoo, her fair skin and blue calico dress a stark contrast to the buckskin and rich copper skin of the Apache. An older man, his face a magnificent roadmap of wrinkles and wisdom, stepped forward. He carried himself with an immense, quiet dignity. This, she knew, must be Chief Nakai. Taza ran to him, and the chief embraced his son, his stern face softening with affection. Kyle dismounted and stood before his father, speaking in their native tongue. His tone was respectful, but firm. As he spoke, he gestured towards Clara, and Nakai's gaze fell upon her. His eyes were ancient, and they seemed to see right through her, weighing and measuring her soul. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. The matter, it seemed, was settled. Clara was led to a wickiup, larger than the others, clearly belonging to Kyle. It was simple but clean inside, with woven blankets and animal pelts for beds, and a small unlit fire pit in the center. A young woman brought her a bowl of stew and a gourd of water, placing it on the ground without a word, and backing away as if Clara might bite. The isolation was immediate and absolute. She was in a village of hundreds, yet she had never felt more alone. Later that evening, Kyle entered. He filled the space with his presence, his broad shoulders seeming to shrink the small dwelling. "You will be safe here," he said, standing near the entrance. "You will be given food and shelter. No harm will come to you." Clara found her voice, and it was laced with ice. "Will I be permitted to speak, to choose? Or are those privileges not included in this arrangement?" A flicker of surprise crossed his face. He was a war chief accustomed to being obeyed without question. "You have questions?" "Questions," she gave a short, bitter laugh. "I have 1,000. Let's start with this one. Why not simply accept my thanks for helping your brother and leave me be? Why this charade of a marriage?" Kyle was silent for a moment, his gaze intense. "It is not a charade. Among my people, a debt of life is the most sacred there is. You saved the son of our chief from our enemy. This act has a power. To simply say, thank you, would be an insult to the spirits and to the magnitude of what you did. It would leave the debt to fester an imbalance in the world." He took a step closer. "By making you one of us, by giving you the name and protection of my family. We honor you in the highest way we know. We absorb the debt into our kinship. You are not a prisoner. You are honored." "I feel like a prisoner," she shot back, her chin high. "I was taken from my home, from my life. I have a new name, bride, that I did not choose. In my world, that is not honor. It is bondage." He seemed to consider her words carefully. "Your world is not my world. Here you have a place. You have protection. In your world, you had a piece of dirt that a greedy man was taking from you. You were alone, and you were losing." His words were blunt, and they struck a painful chord of truth. She had been losing, but the choice to lose on her own terms had been hers. He had taken that away. Their standoff was interrupted by the appearance of a woman at the entrance of the wickiup. She was beautiful, with sharp features, eyes like obsidian, and a proud, disdainful expression. She spoke to Cale in Apache, her voice sharp and questioning, her glare fixed on Clara with undisguised hostility. Kyle answered her curtly, his tone dismissive. The woman whose name Clara would later learn was Narlin, tossed her head back and shot Clara one last look of pure venom before disappearing. Who was that? Clara asked, a new sense of unease creeping in. Narlin Kyle said, his face impassive. Her father hoped she and I would be matched, of course, a rival. It seemed her new life came fully equipped with enemies, both outside the camp and within it. You will rest, Kyle said, his tone shifting back to one of command. Tomorrow you will be given clothes. You will learn our ways. He turned and left without another word, leaving Clara alone in the encroaching darkness. She sat on the furs, the untouched stew, beside her growing cold. Kyle's logic was alien to her, a tapestry woven from threads of honor, spirit, and kinship she couldn't comprehend. He saw this as a payment, an elevation. She saw it as the trading of one cage for another, albeit a larger and far more complicated one. She had been saved by a storm only to find herself trapped in its very eye. Life in the Apache Rancheria was a lesson in humility. Everything Clara knew, every skill that had allowed her to survive on her own, was virtually useless here. She couldn't tan a hide-weaver basket or grind mesquite beans into flour. The Apache women were masters of their environment, their hands always busy, their movements efficient and purposeful. In their world, Clara was clumsy, ignorant, and slow. They treated her with a detached, wary distance. They were not unkind, but they were not welcoming. She was Kyle's woman, the outsider, a curiosity. They spoke around her in their own language, their conversations a wall she couldn't penetrate. The children were the most direct, sometimes pointing at her pale skin and light hair, whispering the word Inda, the Apache word for white people, for the enemy. Narlin was her most ardent tormentor. She never confronted Clara directly, but her hostility was a constant, simmering presence. She would mock Clara's attempts to learn, making loud, critical comments in her own tongue that always ended in the cruel laughter of her friends. She was a constant reminder that Clara was an intruder in their tightly knit world, a disruption to the established order. Kyle, for his part, was a remote and enigmatic figure. He did not share her wickiup at night, instead sleeping with the other unmarried warriors, a custom that both relieved and confused Clara. He saw to it that she was fed and clothed, providing her with soft buckskin dresses that were infinitely more practical than her calico. He would occasionally try to explain a custom or a belief, his words sparse but deliberate. We do not own the land, he told her one day, as they stood overlooking the valley. We belong to it. The spirits of the mountains, the creek, the eagle, they allow us to be here. We honor them by living in balance. She listened, trying to understand his worldview, so different from the settler's creed of fences' deeds and ownership. But his attempts at explanation always felt more like lessons than conversations. There was a wall between them, built of culture language and the strange circumstances of their union. Clara's spirit, however, was not so easily broken. She was a survivor. If she was to endure this new life, she would have to find her own place in it. She couldn't compete with the other women at their own skills, but she had knowledge they didn't. She had a deep understanding of herbs and remedies passed down from her mother. She began to watch, to learn. She saw that one of the elders, a woman named Tona, was the camp's healer. Clara quietly observed her, recognizing some of the plants Tona used, but seeing others that were new to her. One day, a child fell into a patch of cholla cactus, his arm a pincushion of painful barbed spines. His mother was frantic, and Tona was struggling to remove the spines without tearing the boy's flesh. Clara stepped forward. "Let me," she said quietly. The mother looked at her with distrust, but Tona, her eyes wise and tired, gestured for her to proceed. Clara remembered a trick Jedediah had used for porcupine quills. She took a comb from her small bag of belongings and carefully, gently used the fine teeth to get under the clusters of spines, rolling them out cleanly without breaking them off in the skin. The boy, who had been howling in pain, quieted to a whimper. When she was done, the boy's mother gave her a look of grudging respect. Tona looked at Clara's comb, then at Clara, and gave a small approving nod. It was a tiny victory, but for Clara it felt like a monumental one. She had been useful. She had contributed. Her relationship with Cale began to slowly, subtly shift. He had seen what she did for the boy. That evening he came to her wickiup and sat by her fire the first time he had done so. "Tona says you have the healer's touch," he said. "I know some things," Clara replied, her eyes on the flames. "Your hands are clever," he added, his gaze dropping to her hands. "They are not weak like I thought they might be." It was the closest he had come to a compliment. A fragile bridge was being built between them, spanning the chasm of their different worlds. She found herself watching him when he didn't know it, observing the way he trained the young warriors, the respect he commanded, the gentle way he spoke to his father. She saw not just the fearsome war chief, but the man beneath a man, burdened by duty and honor. But as the whispers of respect for Clara began to grow within the camp, the drums of war began to beat outside of it. A scout returned one evening, his horse lathered and his face grim. He reported to Nakai and Cale, and the news spread through the rancheria like a grass fire. Silas Blackwood had not heeded Cale's warning. Enraged and humiliated, he had ridden to the nearest army fort. He twisted the story, painting Cale and his warriors as a savage band of renegades who had attacked his peaceful ranch, murdered his foreman in cold blood, and kidnapped a white woman. He conveniently left out the eviction notice and his own years of harassment. A cavalry patrol led by an ambitious young captain named Miller had been dispatched to investigate and to rescue the captive Clara May Thompson. They were a week's ride away, but they were coming. The mood in the camp shifted instantly. The peaceful rhythm of daily life was replaced by the urgent preparations for war. Warriors checked their weapons, women prepared food and supplies, and a tense, grim energy settled over the valley. That night, Kyle came to her again. The firelight cast flickering shadows on the planes of his face, making him look even more formidable. "The soldiers are coming," he said, his voice low. "They come for you. They come because Blackwood lied to them." Clara said, her heart sinking. She was the cause of this, the unwilling catalyst for a war she never wanted. His lies and their reasons do not matter. They are a threat to my people, to our home. We will fight them." His jaw was set like granite. "Many will be hurt," she whispered, "or killed. It is our way. We defend our own." He looked at her, and the wall between them seemed to crumble for a moment, revealing a raw vulnerability she had never seen. "But it is your face they will carry on their flag. Blackwood has made you their excuse. When the fighting starts, you will be in the greatest danger. From them and, perhaps, even from some of my own people who see you as the source of this trouble." He was talking about Narlin and her faction. Clara understood perfectly. If blood was spilled, she would be blamed. She looked at him, at this fierce, proud man who had claimed her to settle a debt. "What do you want me to do?" He reached out his hand, hesitating for a moment, before his fingers gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. The simple touch was an earthquake. It was the first time he had touched her with anything other than command or necessity. "I want you to be safe," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I claimed you to honor a debt. But the thought of them harming you, it is a fire in my gut. I will not let that happen." In that moment, Clara realized with a shocking certainty that his feelings for her had grown beyond the cold calculus of honor. And more terrifyingly, she realized her own feelings had changed as well. She no longer saw him as just a captor. She saw his strength, his fierce devotion to his people, and the unexpected tenderness he kept so carefully hidden. Her resentment had slowly, imperceptibly, morphed into a complex and frightening admiration. An admiration that felt dangerously close to something else entirely. The war drums were beating, and a reckoning was coming, not just from the soldiers, but from within her own heart. The Apache chose to meet the soldiers in the valley of Bitter Creek. Clara insisted on riding with them, her voice passionate. "They come because of me," she argued with Kyle. "Let me show them I am not a captive. My presence could stop this war before it begins." Seeing the unbreakable spirit he'd come to admire, Kyle agreed. They set the ambush, and as the cavalry entered the canyon, Kyle made his declaration, "Clara May Thompson is my wife." From a high ledge, Clara's voice echoed his clear and strong, "I am here by my own choice," enraged and seeing his plan fail. Silas Blackwood fired his pistol, and the canyon erupted into a hell of smoke and terror. Amid the chaos, Clara saw Blackwood moving to flank Cale's exposed position. Heedless of the danger, she ran into the open to warn him. Blackwood turned his pistol on her, a triumphant sneer on his face. Seeing her peril, Cale roared her name and charged through a hail of bullets. He saw the man who had claimed her as a debt now ready to die for her. His ferocity was absolute as he subdued Blackwood, ending the fight and forcing the soldiers' surrender. As the sun set over the blood-soaked valley, Kyle stood with her by the creek. "The life debt is paid," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "You are free to go." Clara looked at his face, at the people who had fought for her, and knew her lonely cabin was just a memory. She had found something she thought was lost, forever. A home. "I am home," she whispered, placing her hand in his. A slow, wondrous smile transformed Kyle's features. He lifted her hand, his touch no longer a claim, but a promise. "Then, my bride," he said, "welcome home." And so the story of Clara and Kyle became a legend whispered across the territory, a tale not of a captive and her captor, but of two souls from different worlds who found a common ground in courage and respect. Theirs was a love forged in the crucible of the Wild West, a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest risks lead to the most profound rewards. They proved that a family isn't always the one you're born into, but the one you're brave enough to fight for. Their story reminds us that beneath the divisions of culture and the conflicts of the frontier, the human heart beats with the same universal desires for safety, for belonging, and for a love powerful enough to bridge any divide. If this story of unlikely love and unwavering courage moved you, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share it with someone who loves a timeless tale of the American West. And don't forget to subscribe for more true-life dramas and epic romances from history. Your support helps us keep these incredible stories alive. Thank you for listening.